We are shown impeccable facades and are told this is art. Yet the facts scream that these buildings were industrial machines for air management, surpassing the efficiency of modern offices. The main question is, why was a technology ahead of its time made to disappear? You have believed your whole life in the myth of the technological progress of the 20th century. The history of architecture has been rewritten to conceal the main truth. Buildings of power have always been constructed as tools of control. We are told that smart homes and climate control have only recently appeared. But look at the technical reports of the Reichstag from 1894. Electric telemetry was already in place, transmitting temperature data from the entire building to a central console in real time. Air was calculated mathematically, cleaned at a height of 70 meters, and supplied in a way that controlled the minds of those who made the laws. 130 years ago. How is it that the parliaments and imperial palaces of the past had better ventilation than modern elite clinics? Why could engineers of the past ensure an ideal climate for thousands of people without freon and compressors? Why has the function of air management always been pushed out of sight, hidden in basements and neighboring districts, leaving the public with only the illusion of magic? The official history speaks of luxury and aesthetics, yet the real blueprints prove air was not just a living environment, it was a measured resource, a hidden mechanism of absolute power. And why was it suddenly decided to forget about this hidden infrastructure? Climate control was invented in the 20th century. That's what we're told. That's what is written in textbooks. That's what tour guides explain at the entrance of any ancient castle. People used to just freeze, sweat, breathe in smoke, and dealt with it. They accepted it as a given. They endured. And then electricity came, and everything changed. I believed in it for a long time, until I started looking at the numbers. Here is the first number I suggest you keep in mind. The year is 1822. In the basement of a medieval castle in northern Poland, an official experiment is being conducted. A cold hall at 6 degrees Celsius. The stove is heated for 3.5 hours. Special hatches in the floor are opened. 20 minutes later, the hall, with an area of 850 square meters, reaches 22.5 degrees. The system is not touched. After 7 days, the hall is still at 16 degrees. The result is recorded in the official protocol. This is not a legend. It is a documented engineering test. The protocol is preserved in the archives to this day. The second figure, 1995. The Hungarian parliament, built in 1904, finally switches to electric cooling. Until this moment, the halls were cooled with ice that was harvested in winter from the Danube. 90 years, without a single major modernization. 90 years is longer than any modern air conditioner will last. Third, the year 1854. The Hospital for the Poor in Paris sets a standard for fresh air supply, 60 cubic meters per hour per patient. 170 years later, this standard is still considered excessive in many modern clinics. When you start to count, not reading guidebooks, not listening to audio guides, but actually counting, it turns out something strange. 8 buildings constructed between 1519 and 1904 contain within them air, heat, and humidity control engineering systems that operated without electricity for decades. And almost none of these systems made it into the official descriptions of the sites. Tourists are shown facades. Guides talk about kings. Textbooks write about styles. But what happens inside the walls, beneath the floors, in the basements, remains unspoken. Not because it's unknown. The archives are open. The blueprints are kept. The protocols are accessible. It's just that no one tells these stories. There is a question that I cannot unsee after asking it. If this was merely engineering for comfort, why was it hidden? Why are the systems that controlled the air in parliaments and palaces designed to be invisible? Why is the mechanism always concealed, while the facade is always impeccable? Perhaps the answer is simple. It's the aesthetics of the era. Architects did not want to ruin the exterior appearance. All right, let's assume that's the case. But then explain why the mechanism is hidden both outside and inside. Visitors to the Winter Palace see no signs of the heating system, neither from the outside nor the inside. Guests at the Parliament in Budapest see chandeliers, but are unaware that they are simultaneously part of the ventilation system. Tourists at Chambord admire the staircase and hear about its architectural play. No one explains that without this staircase, life in the castle would have been physically impossible. Let's break it down, one building at a time. Let's start with Westminster. Not because it is the first chronologically, it actually belongs to the 19th century, but because it is here that the man who created the system first spoke aloud what others had kept silent about. 1849, London. A new Parliament building is under construction on the banks of the Thames, and working on it is Dr. David Boswell Reid, a Scottish chemist, an expert in air chemistry. Reid wrote in his work diary a phrase that I read and couldn't forget for several days. He wrote, "The quality of the air in the chamber determines the quality of the decisions made. Stale air breeds irritation. Fresh air promotes clarity of thought. My instrument is air. My object is legislation." Reid did not hide what he was doing. He spoke about it openly. And that is precisely why his name is almost absent from standard descriptions of Westminster. Because acknowledging that the climate in the parliamentary chamber was intentionally manipulated by a scientist to influence the mental state of the MPs is no longer comfort. It is something else entirely. Westminster had 2,000 vertical shafts in its walls. A 2016 study confirmed that the walls of Parliament are literally hollow for 25% of their volume. This is the building's bronchial system. Air intakes at a height of 75 meters were installed to avoid the great stench of the Thames. 1,000,000 tiny holes in the floor of the House of Commons allowed air to be supplied diffusely through carpets with a precisely calculated density. 64 exhaust lamps on the ceiling. The heat from the lamps drew stale air into the ceiling ducts. Reid changed the air parameters 100 times during a single session. He sat at the console in the basement, monitoring the temperature, carbon dioxide concentration, and airflow velocity. He collected surveys from the deputies after each meeting and made adjustments the next day. This was the first systematic management of the atmosphere in a public building in history, utilizing feedback from users. Reid is the main character of this story. That is why I start with him, not with Chambord, because he is the only one who articulated the principle. The other 6 buildings implemented it silently. He spoke it aloud, and that is precisely why he was excluded. He was expelled from Westminster in 1852 after a long public conflict with architect Barry. The official reason? Disagreements in professional methods. The real reason? Reid was demanding more constructive changes for ventilation, while Barry wanted to preserve the pure Gothic silhouette. In the end, Barry won. The appearance. Reid was dismissed. His name disappeared from the official history of the building, but his system remained, and it functioned for decades after his departure. Reed was the first to name things as they were. He voiced aloud what others were quietly realizing. Air is a tool of influence. For this, he was removed. The other 6 buildings never expressed this. The mechanism was silent. The facade spoke. That's why they have survived to this day in official textbooks, while Reed is mentioned only in footnotes. Now, from the beginning, from the very start of the line, Chambord, the Loire Valley, France, 1519. The largest and most ambitious castle of the French Renaissance. 282 rooms. No, wait, 282 fireplaces. 440 rooms. 84 staircases. And at the center of it all, the famous double spiral staircase with a diameter of 9 meters, described by tourist brochures as an architectural marvel. 2 people ascend simultaneously, see each other through windows between the flights, and never meet. Beautiful, poetic, useless from a logical standpoint, if it's merely a curiosity. Tourists are brought here by the 500,000 each year. They are told about Francis I, about the Renaissance, about what they say, perhaps it was Leonardo. 30 minutes of sightseeing, a photograph by the staircase, souvenirs at the exit. The question that no one asks, if there are 282 sources of fire in this castle, how did people survive? It is not asked. It is not in the audio guide. It is not on the informational boards. The tour is arranged so that it does not come up. But here's what doesn't make it into the guidebooks. 282 fireplaces are not a decoration. It's a catastrophic engineering problem. When several dozen fireplaces operate simultaneously in a confined space, the concentration of carbon monoxide rises to lethal levels within just a few hours. This is physics, not history. When Francis I received foreign ambassadors at Chambord, and the halls were filled with hundreds of courtiers, with dozens of fireplaces burning, the castle must have had a ventilation system. Without it, this isn't a hunting lodge. It's a mass grave. And there was a system. It just was never described as a system. Look at the staircase differently, not as an architectural play, but as an engineering blueprint. The diameter is 9 meters, a hollow central core with windows facing all 4 galleries. The staircase leads directly to a massive aeration lantern at a height of 56 meters, the highest point of the keep. What happens physically in this configuration? Warm air, heated by fireplaces in the 4 vestibules, rises to the vault. The staircase creates a central vertical channel, thermal draft. Hot air, saturated with smoke and carbon dioxide, is literally sucked upwards and expelled through the lantern. The staircase is not an architectural whim. The staircase is an extraction. A central vacuum pump designed for the volume of gases from 282 combustion sources. Without it, the lock could not function. Physically. Let's break down how this works in detail. The double helix creates 2 independent ascending channels that rotate in the same direction. This is not just 2 separate staircases, it's a geometry that enhances the lift. The airflow in each channel spirals, and the 2 streams moving side by side create a Venturi effect. a zone of reduced pressure in the central core. It is this vacuum that drives the entire system. Hot air from the galleries is literally drawn into this zone and moves upward. This is what Leonardo studied in his notebooks as the movement of a vortex in a tube. Not abstract physics, a working principle. And he applied it to architecture. Look at the roof of Chambord. What tourists see as a forest of chimneys, 282 chimneys plus decorative additions, is not chaos. It's an exhaust system. Each chimney rises to a specific height, designed so that its aerodynamic interaction with neighboring chimneys does not create backdrafts. This is the same challenge that modern engineers face when designing industrial boilers, only without computer modeling, on paper with a quill. Look at the building plan. The Greek cross consists of 4 wings radiating from the central keep along the axes. This is not symbolism, it is aerodynamics. The cross-shaped layout provides cross-ventilation in all 4 directions. The wind enters from any side. The system functions. In any wind direction, at least one wing acts as an intake duct, while the opposite one serves as an exhaust. The building's geometry itself is a ventilation scheme. In the 1990s, a network of drainage channels and voids was discovered beneath Chambord, corresponding to sketches attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. Breathing walls are not a metaphor in his notes. This is a technical term. And here is a detail that stopped me when I encountered it. The design of the central part of Chambord, the keep and the staircase, is attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. He lived in France at the court of Francis I from 1516. He passed away in May 1519, precisely when the foundation was being laid. In his notebooks, in what we know as the Atlantic Codex, there are detailed calculations of vortex mechanics, the movement of air masses, the swirling of flows in vertical channels. Leonardo did not draw beautiful spirals for the sake of beauty. He studied how air moves within a pipe. Officially, it's a coincidence. At first glance, perhaps. But then explain why not a single guidebook clarifies how 282 fireplaces did not turn the halls into a smokehouse. Nobody asks this question. It simply doesn't exist in the official description of the monument. Tourists are told, architectural fantasy, and then on to the next hall. Without the chimney, life in a castle with so many fireplaces would be physically impossible. This is an engineering requirement for the existence of the building. Yet no guidebook mentions this. The mechanism is hidden. The facade is flawless. Chambord hid its mechanism in the staircase. The next building took it a step further. It concealed the mechanism beneath the floor. And it addressed a completely different task. Not air, humidity. Because humidity didn't kill people. It killed information. Escorial, the plateau of Castile, Spain. 1563 to 1584. A colossal granite monolith, 207 by 161 meters. Officially, a monastery, a palace, a mausoleum. Ascetic style without decorations, bare stone, icy wind from the Guadarrama Mountains. The place where Philip II ruled the largest empire in the world. Here's a fact worth keeping in mind. Philip II was obsessed with paperwork. Not with power in the abstract sense, specifically with documents. Reports from spies, maps of conquered territories, correspondence with governors from all continents. The library at El Escorial housed 40,000 manuscripts and books. 40,000. It was a state archive, an intelligence base, and an analytical center, all in one building. This building had a problem that official historians mention only in passing, if at all. The Castilian Highlands. The climate, which locals describe as 9 months of winter, 3 months of hell. Condensation and mold destroy paper over decades. With such a temperature and humidity fluctuation, 40,000 documents should have turned to dust within a maximum of 50 years. Yet they have survived to this day. How? In the basements of Escorial, there is a network of brick channels that run underneath the floor tiles throughout the monastery complex. This system was called Gloria, not heating system, specifically Gloria, from the Latin for glory. It was heated with straw, hay, and vine shoots. Slowly burning plant material. The hot gases moved through the labyrinth at an exceedingly slow pace, warming the massive stone floor from the inside. Not for warmth in the human sense. According to the rules, monks were to be cold. The system operated to stabilize the humidity in the library halls. A heated stone mass once maintained a stable microclimate for up to 3 days. Now for the detail that changes the angle of perception. All the fuel-loading openings have been moved to the outer courtyards. The servants brought straw from the outside. They never entered the grand halls at all. No smoke, no dust from the fuel, only the warmth coming up from the stone below. Inside the building, there was no visible source of heat. The walls were cold. There were no stoves, but the paper does not rot. The most obvious explanation is a fortunate coincidence of climate. But then, why 11 tanks in the foundation, functioning as thermal buffers to smooth out daily fluctuations? Why is the entire building oriented with consideration for the prevailing Atlantic winds, so that the facades do not accumulate moisture? This is not a random stroke of luck. This is calculation. Consider what this means physically. The granite used to build the Escorial has a high heat capacity. This choice of material is not a coincidence. There are other types of stone in Castile. The architects specifically chose granite. Once heated, it retains that heat. 11 cisterns filled with rainwater in the foundation acted as thermal buffers. The water, with its immense heat capacity, smoothed out daily temperature fluctuations. The entire building was designed as a physical machine, where every element, from the choice of stone to the orientation of the facades, served a single purpose: to maintain a stable climate inside, regardless of the conditions outside. Historians refer to Gloria as a peasant technology. This is true. In Castile, floors were heated this way in village houses for centuries. But no one asks the obvious question. If this is such a simple and accessible technology, why wasn't it installed in all the halls? Why only under the library and the royal chambers? The monks are freezing. The archives are warm. The prioritization is completely transparent. I think about Philip II differently than is customary. Historians write about him as a religious fanatic. But the man who built the world's first global information network, spies, cartographers, systematic reports from 6 continents, this man thought about the preservation of his data. El Escorial was not just a monastery. It was a data center, and the physical structure was designed so that information would live forever. Literally, in the form of paper. There is a well-known historical anecdote about Philip II. It is said that he made decisions so slowly that one of his ministers remarked, If death comes from Spain, we shall all live to old age. Historians interpret this as a weakness. I think differently. A person who managed an archive of 40,000 documents from a desk and made decisions only after receiving written reports is not a slow person. He is the first leader in history who insisted on documented justification for every decision. El Escorial was the infrastructure of this system, and the heating system was part of this infrastructure. It protected the information carriers from physical destruction. Peasant straw-fired technology serving the imperial archive. Architectural historians do not like to acknowledge this, because it shatters the image of grandeur. The great monastery of the world operated on the same technology as the huts of shepherds. But here is the contrast that seems most fitting in this story. The Escorial monastery was built as a symbol of asceticism. No excess, no luxury. And indeed, the monks shivered. There are no decorations. Everything is harsh and austere. But the library is warm. The archive is secured. Information is comfortable. The body can be subjected to the cold. Data cannot. This is a choice made consciously, and it speaks more about Philip II than any grand portrait. The Escorial is below the surface. The next building brought the mechanism out into the very walls and turned the air into something more than just a physical environment. It made the air an instrument of power. December 1837. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg burns for 3 days. The cause? The chimneys from the fireplaces, which had not been cleaned for years, ran through wooden structural beams. The fire moved through these hidden channels as if they were finished tunnels. Nicholas I watched the fire from the Neva. When the flames were extinguished, he set one condition for the reconstruction: no open sources of fire in the grand halls, no fireplaces, no stoves in sight. General Engineer Nikolai Amasov approached this task radically. To understand the scale of the task, imagine this. Nicholas I wants to hold a ball next winter, in a building that is burned down to its foundation. In 18 months, it is necessary not only to restore thousands of rooms, but also to create a heating system that leaves no open flames in sight, warms 3,000 spaces, and yet gives no hint of its mechanism. The challenge is to achieve architectural invisibility while maximizing engineering capabilities. Amasov managed it, but it cost him 5 years of health. He worked almost without sleep throughout the entire construction. 84 cast iron furnaces in the basements enclosed in brick casings. Each served its own sector. But the heated air did not flow through the pipes in the conventional sense. It moved within the brickwork itself, through a network of heat channels that pierced the walls from top to bottom. The outlets through which the warmth burst into the halls were disguised as gilded decorative rosettes, soul vents. There were over 100 in the ceremonial rooms. They appeared as a decorative element. They made the building feel light. Fresh air flowed from the Neva through the Z-shaped ducts in the base. The curve of the duct filtered out street dust and softened gusts of wind. The air arrived clean and draft-free. Look at the numbers. Up to 15% of the volume of some walls of the Winter Palace consists of empty air channels. In the St. George's Hall, with an area of 800 square meters, there is not a single stove, not a single visible source of heat. With the temperature outside at 30 degrees below zero, it consistently remains 18 to 20 degrees inside, constantly, around the clock. Because in the basement, the stokers worked around the clock. An army of people who had never been seen. They maintained the fire in 84 Amos monsters so that the 5,000 guests at the imperial ball wouldn't freeze, nor be poisoned. All this power, all this glitter and gold rested on the people under the floor whom no one ever saw. Now ask yourself one question. Who was the operator with the dampers in the basement? Technically, just a stoker, but physically, a person capable of transforming the ballroom with 5,000 guests from warm to icy in an hour, or from cool to stuffy. The state of the people in the hall directly depended on what the person in the basement was doing. None of the guests at the ball were aware of this. The system was so powerful that all the old wooden furniture cracked within a single season. The air was too dry and too hot. They had to switch to metal decor elements. The palace literally re-equipped its interior to meet the demands of the new engineering system. Here's what's missing from the official description of the Hermitage. They talk about gilding, about the collection, about the sparkle, but that the brick channels through which hot air once flowed still lie beneath the feet of visitors. There's not a word about that. The mechanism is hidden. The facade is flawless. All three buildings from the first block share one characteristic. The system functioned from within the architecture. The stairs, floors, and walls themselves were the mechanism. The next two buildings took a different direction. They brought the entire mechanism outside, beyond the visible, so that the facade would not resemble anything at all. And here's what is interesting. In the first block, Chambord, Escorial, Winter, the system is hidden within the building itself. This means that each architectural element carries a dual burden. It simultaneously looks as it should and performs its intended function. The staircase is both beautiful and functional. The floor is grand and warm. The wall is adorned and breathable. This demands far greater skill from the designer than merely planning a separate technical system. Here, aesthetics and engineering do not contradict each other. They are inseparable. In the second block, Liverpool, Budapest, the approach is different. The mechanism is deliberately exposed. This is already the era of specialization. There is an architect responsible for aesthetics, and there is an engineer responsible for what happens inside. The conflict between them is not merely personal. It is a clash of two philosophies of building. In Liverpool, this conflict manifested literally. Reed wanted a 60-meter tower. The architect said no. The tower disappeared into the facade's decor. Reed got 4 hidden shafts instead of 1 visible one. From an engineering perspective, this is worse. From an architectural appearance perspective, it's better. The architectural appearance won. The mechanism became invisible once again. Liverpool, 1841 to 1854. St. George's Hall. Outside, a neoclassical temple. Columns, a portico, granite. Inside, a concert hall for 2,500 people and courtrooms. 51. The opening. Industrial Liverpool at its peak. Smog, soot, the smell of horse urine from the streets, coal dust hanging in the air from dawn till dusk. Dr. David Reed, The very engineer who was concurrently working on Westminster designed something for this hall for which there was no word in 1951 yet. But before describing the system, it is important to highlight the person. Reid was a Scotsman, trained as a chemist, and he specialized in what he called air chemistry. In the late 1830s, he conducted a series of experiments in Edinburgh, measuring the composition of air in enclosed spaces with varying numbers of people and different ventilation modes. His main conclusion was this: as carbon dioxide accumulates in a hall, it not only creates stuffiness, but also decreases the cognitive abilities of those present. People in poorly ventilated rooms think worse, make more impulsive decisions, and tire more quickly. It was a scientific argument for government funding of ventilation, and it worked. Reid was invited to Westminster and then to Liverpool, the world's first air scrubber for a public building. At the system's entrance, the air passed through a water curtain. Nozzles sprayed a mist that settled industrial soot and coal dust from Liverpool. The air entered dirty and exited clean. Beneath the main hall's floor, covering thousands of square meters, were hundreds of brick columns forming a thermal labyrinth. In summer, the cool brick chilled the incoming airflow. In winter, steam coils heated it. 4 3-meter diameter fan blades, the size of aircraft propellers of that time, were powered by a steam engine with 10 horsepower. The airflow rate was 25 cubic meters per second. The air distribution dampers in the hall were made from canvas stretched over frames. A lever control system was in place. One operator, seated at the control panel in the basement, manually adjusted the climate in the hall with precision down to the degree. During the winter period, Reid used special nozzles to humidify the excessively dry air heated by the heating system. He considered not only the temperature, but also the composition of the air. He thought about what exactly the 2,500 people were inhaling while sitting in a closed hall for several hours straight. This represented a fundamentally new way of thinking. Air not as a given, but as a managed resource. Initially, Reid planned a separate 60-meter exhaust tower next to the building. Neighbors complained about the site. The tower was removed. Its functions were distributed among 4 corner shafts, hidden within the decorative elements of the facade. Nothing is visible from the street. Classic columns, clean stone. Inside, a factory. One of the original heating radiators is now on display at the local Heritage Center as a museum exhibit. Almost no one knows about it. Everyone knows the organ in the main hall. The 30-meter tunnels beneath the floor, through which conditioned air flowed with a whistle, are unknown. This is the pattern. The mechanism is hidden. The facade is everything that is seen. The Hungarian parliament took this logic to the extreme. Budapest, 1885 to 1904. Architect Imre Steindl. 268 meters in length. 473,000 cubic meters of volume. 40 million bricks. 88 towers. 365 spires. And not a single chimney on the roof. This is not a slip of the tongue. Look at the photos. Not a single one. A building of this scale, the 3rd largest parliament in the world, has no visible sources of emissions. It has no excretory organs. How was it heated? Steindl moved the boiler room to a separate building on Balaschi Street, 150 meters from the parliament. Steam was delivered through underground insulated corridors. All the smoke, all the soot, all the smell of burning coal, away from the block. The facade is crystal clear. This is the first example in Europe of remote centralized heating for a public building. Cooling in the summer was achieved differently. fresh air was drawn not from street level, but through two fountains in Kossuth Park via underground chambers. In the summer, ice was placed in these chambers, 15 to 20 tons daily. The ice was harvested in winter from the Danube River and Lake Balaton, stored in special ice houses, and delivered to the Parliament as needed. The air passed over the ice, cooled down, and then was supplied to the halls already chilled. Take a moment to think about the logistics of this. Winter, the Danube. Workers are chopping ice, loading it onto carts, and transporting it to specially built underground refrigerators beneath the Parliament. In spring and summer, this ice is used in batches, 20 tons every day. The replenishment begins in May when the rivers break up. All summer long, they use imported river ice. Air is circulated throughout the entire building at a rate of 160,000 cubic meters per hour through two external intake vents. 20 tons of ice a day is no small feat. It's a constant logistical operation. Every morning, carts arrived at the Parliament. The ice was lowered into underground chambers through special hatches in the pavement, ensuring that nothing was visible from the outside. No ice carts at the front entrance. No fuss. The deputies ascended the marble steps, entered the cool halls, and had not the slightest idea that underneath them a daily industrial operation was underway. This system operated without fundamental changes until the mid-90s of the 20th century. 90 years. Without electric chillers, without freon, just ice from the river and the physics of convection. The ventilation of the halls worked through the chandeliers. Used air was sucked out by fans embedded in the domes of the light fixtures. The chandeliers not only illuminated, but also breathed. They were part of the system. This is a detail that stops me every time. Not the pipe in the corner, not the grill above the door. The chandelier, the main symbol of the grand hall, the most demonstrative element of the interior, also serves as a ventilation hub. The visitor looks up and thinks about beauty. And in the meantime, beauty is actively breathing. The Parliament of Budapest is a completed model of the invisible city. All the dirty infrastructure, smoke, coal, smell, has been pushed beyond the limits of perception. Inside, there is a controlled climate and a sense that the building exists without mechanisms. Outside, 365 spires and not a single chimney. This is not random beauty. It is a principle. Two buildings from the second block concealed a mechanism beyond their walls. The third block is the most unexpected. Here, architects and engineers were not just managing the climate for comfort. They were managing air as a resource. They measured it. They dosed it. And in one case, they openly stated that they were doing this deliberately as a political decision. There is a difference between making it so that it is not cold and calculating exactly how much air each person needs per hour. The first is a household task. The second is a scientific program. This distinction occurs in the third block. Air transforms from a physical necessity into a manageable variable. An era begins when buildings are not just ventilated, they are measured. Paris, 1846 to 1854. Lariboisière Hospital, the 10th arrondissement. 6 separate stone buildings surrounding a central courtyard. 1,333 beds. Built in response to the cholera epidemic of 1832. Contemporaries called it the Versailles for the poor. And this is no irony. The architecture was indeed at the level of a palace complex. Symmetry, galleries, a central chapel with a dome. But this is the first building in history where the air was designed mathematically, as a therapeutic remedy. Standard: 60 cubic meters of fresh air per hour per patient. Take a good look at this figure. In many modern hospitals, this standard is lower. In the mid-19th century, when the word ventilation was just beginning to enter the professional vocabulary, the air supply standard in a Parisian charity hospital was set at a level that is now considered excessive. Here, a battle of systems took place, literally. In different buildings, two competing approaches were being tested simultaneously. The Gruvela system employed forced ventilation. A steam engine in a separate building drove a centrifugal fan, pushing air through copper coils. The Duvoir-Leblanc system relied on natural thermosiphon draft. Air was heated by hot water and rose up through Z-shaped ducts without any mechanical drive. Both were working, in different buildings, at the same time. General Arthur Morin arrived with thermometers, manometers, and air samples. He measured the concentration of carbon dioxide in each ward. He recorded the flow rates. He compared them. This was the first systematic assessment of microclimate quality in a building in history, what modern engineers refer to as post-occupancy evaluation. Women's bodies equipped with Leblanc's system were found to be cooler than men's, where Gruvela worked. This led to the first documented gender dispute in the field of microclimate design. 19th century engineers debated whether women should receive the same volume of warm air as men. Records of these debates have been preserved. More than 15,000 detailed drawings of air ducts have been created for the maintenance of the system. 15,000 for one hospital. This is not just repair documentation. It's an engineering headquarters working with air as a precise substance. The fresh air was taken in not at street level, but high above, over the dome of the chapel, to avoid the smells of city landfills and manure. Each chamber had 4 independent heat sources, creating a complex convection loop. The stale air was forcibly drawn into the basement collectors. In Gruvela's system, it was literally sucked into the underground network. The air didn't just escape through a window, it was evacuated in a directed manner. Morin wrote something in his reports that seems key to me. He claimed that a correctly calculated airflow could neutralize the miasmatic origin of disease. He did not know about bacteria. No one did. Pasteur would publish his work 15 years later. But Morin correctly understood the direction. Air is not just an environment in which people get sick. Air is a factor that can be controlled. And by managing it, one can influence the outcome of a disease. This was the first step towards evidence-based environmental medicine. At first glance, Lariboisière seems like just a well-ventilated hospital. But why here, rather than in a military barracks or a wealthy clinic? Why for the poor? I think it's because the poor were the perfect subjects. A large number of patients, a controlled environment, the ability to compare wards with different systems under identical conditions. Lariboisière was a laboratory. Versailles for the poor, a beautiful name for what was essentially the first clinical trial of air quality in history. Another detail that is often overlooked. Morin didn't just measure, he published. His reports were made publicly available. He set standards. When he established the norm of 60 cubic meters per hour per patient, It became a benchmark for all European hospital architecture in the following decades. Through Lariboisière, one hospital for the poor in Paris changed the way hospitals were built throughout Europe. And now consider the political dimension of this norm. 60 cubic meters per hour per patient is more than in many modern Class A European offices. Workers in financial corporations in the 21st century breathe worse than the impoverished in a Paris hospital of the 1850s. Because the office standard is dictated by savings on ventilation, and Morin dictated to medical requirements. This is not nostalgia for the past. It is a recognition of what we have lost in the shift to economic optimization. The transition from Lariboisière to the Reichstag represents a shift from air as medicine to air as state infrastructure, from medical indicators to political ones, from sick bodies to governmental decisions. And the last building. It stands apart, because here, for the first time, an engineer combined air management with electrical control and created the prototype of what we today call a smart building. Yet this did not happen in the 21st century, nor even in the 20th. Berlin, 1894. Reichstag. Architect Paul Vallot, systems engineer, David Grove. But first, the context. Berlin at the end of the 19th century is an industrial hub at the peak of industrialization. Metallurgical plants, chemical productions, coal burns everywhere. The smog is so dense that the facades of buildings in the center blacken just a few years after construction. The average concentration of coal dust in the air of Berlin during those years would, by modern standards, necessitate immediate evacuation of the population and the declaration of a state of emergency. In this air, the highest legislative body of United Germany convened. Grove made a decision that turned the conventional understanding of how a public building is structured on its head. The main air intake of the Reichstag is located at a height of 76 meters, above the zone of smog and industrial dust. The building literally emerges from the polluted atmosphere of Berlin to breathe clean air at that height. This is not an architectural gesture. It is a chemical solution. Consider what this means from an engineering perspective. 76 meters is roughly the height of a 20-story building. To raise the air intake to such a height within the building, the architect had to specifically account for it in the design. It wasn't just about placing a grill at the entrance. It involved designing ductwork that descends from the 76-meter mark down into the basement air preparation system. This is not an addition to architecture. It is a requirement that dictated the architecture. Before entering the halls, 8 million cubic feet of air per hour passed through the central preparation chamber. In winter, it was heated via 13,000 square feet of wrought iron coils. In summer, it was cooled with a special liquid. Humidification or dehumidification was done depending on the season. The air didn't just flow into the halls, it was processed. But it gets more interesting. In most halls, air moves from the bottom to the top. This is the logic of convection. Warm air rises, cold air descends. The problem is that when the air moves upwards, dust from the floor rises too, from carpets, shoes, and the clothes of the deputies. In the Reichstag, Grohmann did the opposite. Fresh air was supplied through the ceiling, cooling the hall from top to bottom. It was extracted through the floor. Dust did not rise. It settled and was directed into the ventilation system, never reaching the breathing level. 8 million cubic feet of air per hour through the system. 1,420 cubic feet per person. 13,000 square feet of heating and cooling coils made of wrought iron in the basement. And here is the detail for which the Reichstag stands last on this list. The temperature in different zones of the building was transmitted to the office of the chief engineer using electrical signals. Sensors in the halls, wires in the walls, readings on the central control panel. The engineer could see the temperature map of the entire building in real time and adjusted the flows accordingly. 1894. Telemetry. Not approximately warm, but precise data from specific points transmitted over a distance and recorded. The prototype of the building management system that is now installed in smart homes as a modern achievement. It was only with Grove that this worked 130 years before the term smart home even came into existence. It is officially documented in the reports from 1887 and 1894. Grove did not hide what he was doing. He simply did it, and his name did not appear in the standard descriptions of the building. Guidebooks about the Reichstag talk about the political history, the fire of 1933, and the restoration by Norman Foster with his new glass dome. There is not a word about David Grove. The mechanism is hidden again, now in history. Now stop and look at all of this as a line, not as a list. 1519. Chambord. The staircase as an extraction, a mechanism in architecture. 1563. Escorial. Straw as a desiccant, a mechanism under the floor. 1838. The Winter Palace. The underground army of furnace workers, a mechanism in the walls. 1849. Westminster. The air as a tool of legislation, a feedback mechanism. 1851. Liverpool. The first scrubber, a mechanism beyond the facade. 1854. Paris. The air feels like medicine. The mechanism is like a medical device. 1885. Budapest. The Danube's ice in the removed boiler room, the mechanism beyond the block. 1894. Berlin. Telemetry and chemical control of the atmosphere, the mechanism as a state system. These are not random inventions by different people in different countries. This is one continuous tradition that has developed over 4 centuries. Each subsequent building was aware of the previous one, or rediscovered the same principles with new tools. Air ceased to be the environment in which we live. It became a resource that is managed. There is one more connection that I noticed while examining these 8 objects. They are all buildings of power. The King's Hunting Lodge, the Empire's Archive, the Emperor's Residence, parliaments, a hospital, state-run, built after a national disaster, the state symbol of Germany. Not a single private home, not a single ordinary building. These technologies were developed for places where decisions are made, where those whose physical condition matters to the state sit. This is not a coincidence. It is a political priority. Now pay attention to another pattern, a chronological one. Between Chambord and the Winter Palace, there are 3 centuries. Between the Winter Palace and the Reichstag, half a century. The pace is accelerating. 3 centuries of slow accumulation of experience, and then, in the 19th century, everything speeds up. Why? Because the 19th century is the era of urban density. For the first time in history, not dozens, but thousands of people gather in one building at the same time. Parliament, concert hall, a hospital with 1,300 beds. In such volumes, air management ceases to be a luxury and becomes a condition for survival. You cannot accommodate 2,500 people in an enclosed hall without a ventilation system. Within an hour, they begin to lose consciousness from lack of oxygen. Industrialization created a problem. Engineers resolved it. And they hid the solution in a way that the public wouldn't see the mechanism. And notice something else. None of these buildings were residential homes. Not a single one was an ordinary structure. The citizens of Berlin breathed smog. The workers of Liverpool breathed coal soot. The monks of Escorial froze. The deputies of the Reichstag breathed purified air from a height of 76 meters. This is not a random distribution of technologies. It is a choice, a conscious and consistent one. They will say these were simply the engineering solutions of their time. It's clear that the builders thought about ventilation. Otherwise, it would have been uncomfortable. Okay, then explain one thing. Why was each of these mechanisms deliberately concealed? The staircase of Chambord, an architectural fantasy. The channels of Escorial, peasant technology. The showers of the Winter Palace, decorative rosettes. The shafts of Liverpool, elements of the facade. The pipes of Budapest, they simply don't exist on the roof. The Reichstag, its system is described in 3 lines at the end of the technical report. Everywhere there is a functioning mechanism, and everywhere there is an effort to conceal the very fact of its existence. It's a pattern. A pattern is a handwriting. If you look even more closely, you'll notice another pattern. In every case, the one who controlled the mechanism was invisible. In Chambord, it was an unknown builder who realized Leonardo's design. In Escorial, it was the chimney monks in the outer courtyards, whom the courtiers never saw. In the Winter Palace, it was an army of people beneath the ballroom floors. In Liverpool, it was a single operator in the basement with canvas curtains. In Budapest, it was workers on Balassi Street, behind the block. In La Riboisière, it was Marin with his measurements, whom the patients did not see. In the Reichstag, it was Grove at the controls with electric signals. The function of controlling air is always pushed beyond the visible. It is always delegated to people who are not seen by those being governed. This is not a technical requirement. The pipe could have run along the exterior wall. The boiler room could have been in the yard. The operator could have sat right in the hall. But no, always concealed, always invisible. And here's what's strange about it. In all 8 cases, the invisibility of the mechanism was more expensive than its efficiency. The raid in Liverpool opted for 4 small shafts instead of 1 large tower, only because the tower would be visible from the street. Amasov in the Winter Palace disguised the vents under gilded grills, although open grates would have provided better circulation. Steindl in Budapest moved the boiler room a block away, adding 150 meters of piping and complexity. Each time, the engineer paid a technical price for a political requirement. The mechanism must not be visible. This is not aesthetics. This is a principle. This is not paranoia. This is engineering. This is architecture. This is 4 centuries of the same choice made by different people in different countries, independently of one another. Or not independently. We do not know. The archives remain silent precisely where they could speak. There is one fact that I haven't mentioned but is worth stating outright. All 8 buildings on this list still stand. Chambord stands. El Escorial stands. The Winter Palace stands. Liverpool, Budapest, La Riboisière, the Reichstag, Malbork, all stand. All 8. Considering that the average lifespan of a public building in Europe is about 150 years, none of these buildings fall into that statistic. Coincidence? Or are buildings designed with maximum attention to the physical conditions inside simply better at serving those who inhabit them, and therefore not demolished? Malbork, which I saved for last, stands apart. Because there, the story is not about a hidden mechanism. It's a story about a mechanism that operated openly, and to which official history denied respect in another way. It simply fell silent. The largest brick castle in the world. Poland, 13th to 15th century. Residence of the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order. In winter, temperatures can drop to -20 degrees. In the banquet halls, covering an area of 850 square meters, the knights would sit without outerwear. How? In the basements stood 30 furnaces. Above each one were granite boulders with a diameter of 40 to 50 centimeters. The furnace was fueled with dry spruce, 0.7 cubic meters at a time, for 3.5 hours. The stones were heated to 200 to 300 degrees. Then the chimney was sealed with an airtight valve. After that, decorative floor hatches were opened in the halls. The air from the hall descended to the heated stones, instantly warming up and rising back, clean, without smoke, without soot. Break this down into operations. The charging process, 3.5 hours of burning with proper draft control, so that the granite, rather than the brick of the chimney, absorbs the maximum thermal energy. This requires experience. A newcomer will simply heat the air in the pipe, while a master knows when to close the damper so that the residual heat of the chimney doesn't escape into the pipe, but is added to the stones. Then comes the transmission phase. Open hatches create a convection circuit. The heavy, cold air descends toward the stones. The light, hot air rises into the room. No smoke, because the combustion has already completed and the damper is closed. This is a fundamentally different approach than a fireplace. A fireplace heats while it burns and consumes oxygen. The Malbork system heats after the combustion has finished. No open flame, no carbon monoxide. Clean convective exchange through heated granite. From a physics standpoint, it is more elegant than any modern radiator. A radiator heats the air in contact with it. The hot air rises while the cold air sinks to the floor, creating a constant vertical flow, with the lower third of the room always colder than the upper part. In the Malbork system, hot air is supplied from below and slowly rises evenly. The entire column of air from floor to ceiling is heated more uniformly. Medieval knights in their halls breathed warmer air than most modern office workers at their central heating radiators. This is a fact, not rhetoric. In the year 1822, an official test was conducted. It was recorded in the log. The cold stove raised the temperature in the giant hall from 6 to 22.5 degrees in 3.5 hours of burning. This occurred 20 minutes after the hatches were opened. The stones maintained a comfortable temperature in the hall for 7 days after a single firing. 7 days. Remember this number, because it is not important in itself, but in comparison. A modern cast iron radiator for central heating retains heat, at best, for a few hours after being turned off. A system made of granite boulders, designed in the 15th century, holds it for a week. This does not mean that the Middle Ages were technologically superior. It means that the principle of thermal inertia through massive natural accumulators, a principle known 600 years ago, was simply abandoned when switching to electricity and cast iron. Not improved, not adapted, abandoned. Historians often say, this is a primitive medieval technology. Okay, then answer one question. Why does modern central heating not retain heat for 7 days after being turned off? A modern gas radiator holds a maximum of a few hours of thermal inertia. The Malbork system holds it for 7 days. Because granite is a natural accumulator with a huge heat capacity, while a cast iron radiator is just a heater. The efficiency is around 90%. A modern gas battery ranges from 85 to 92. After 600 years, we've reached the same level, based on the same principle of thermal inertia, just with different fuel. Under the hatches, fragments of ceramic bowls were found. They were used to pour water onto hot stones to prevent the air from becoming too dry. This is a humidifier from the 15th century. The original stoves have been preserved in the cellars of Malbork to this day. The piles of granite boulders remain in place. The channels in the brick walls are passable. The floor covers and plugs in some halls can still be seen. This is not a reconstruction or an illustration. It is a living testimony. The Teutonic Order was the engineering elite of medieval Europe. This is not a metaphor. It is a description of a fact. They built not only castles but also cities, canals, and irrigation systems. The management of water and air was part of their administrative competence. The order had a body of engineer monks who traveled from one construction site to another, sharing technologies. The castles of the Teutonic Order in Poland, Prussia, and Livonia were built according to uniform technical standards. Everywhere that cellars have been preserved, traces of similar systems can be observed. But history remembers knights with swords. It is silent about knights with thermometers. Malbork would take the top spots in any ranking of engineering achievements of the Middle Ages, if such a ranking existed. It does not exist. Because we've been conditioned to measure progress chronologically. The Middle Ages signify backwardness, the 19th century represents progress, and the 20th century is a revolution. However, a system with 90% efficiency that has been around for 600 years does not fit into this scheme. Add here that the Teutonic Knights applied their system not only in Malbork. The order built castles all over the Baltic region, and everywhere where well-examined sites have been preserved, signs of similar cellar systems with accumulating chambers can be seen. This is not a random invention of one genius. It is a standard. The order developed the technology and applied it as a norm of construction. History does not remember this, because the history of the Teutonic Order is a history of defeats, the Battle of Grunwald, decline. Victors do not write technical manuals for the vanquished. But here is what is telling. When Malbork was being restored after the destruction of World War II, Polish restorers discovered basement furnaces and channels in satisfactory condition. The system could have been put into operation. It wasn't. Modern heating was installed instead. The technology, which was 600 years old, was replaced not because it didn't work, but because no one knew how to maintain it. The knowledge of how to regulate the draft, when to close the damper, how much fuel to load at once, this knowledge was oral. It disappeared along with the order. Only the physical shell remained. And here is the counterintuitive point that I struggled to accept for a long time, but eventually did. Malbork is the oldest object on this list, the 15th century. Yet in terms of thermal inertia, 7 days, it surpasses all the other 7. Chambord managed the air better from a safety perspective. The Reichstag managed air quality better from a chemical standpoint. Larrique managed it better from a medical viewpoint. But none of them can boast that, after one heating, they retain warmth for a week. When we say that climate control was invented in the 20th century, we are only telling the truth in one narrow sense: electric climate control. Compressors, refrigerants, central air conditioning based on the refrigeration cycle, yes, that belongs to the 20th century. But air management, no. It's 4 centuries of continuous practice that was interrupted not because it stopped working effectively. It was interrupted because electricity emerged, and with it came companies selling electricity, equipment, and maintenance. The old systems were efficient. They weren't sold every 10 years. They didn't require a subscription contract. The stones of Malbork retained heat for 7 days after a single heating. The ice of the Danube kept the Budapest Parliament cool for 90 years. Straw in the channels of El Escorial protected 40,000 manuscripts for 500 years. None of these systems were primitive in relation to the task they addressed. They were precise. The question that I started this conversation with remains open. Was it engineering for comfort or engineering for control? There is one question that I intentionally set aside. The raid in Westminster did what none of the other 6 did. It recorded. It gathered surveys. It published reports. It spoke out loud about how the environment affects the quality of decisions. And that is precisely why he was ousted, while his system continued to operate for decades after his departure. The mechanism outlived the person who dared to name it. This may be the main pattern of the entire story. Not hidden pipes, not invisible shafts. But what happens to those who name the mechanism? Reed named it and vanished from the official history of the building. Morin published it, and his standard for 170 years became a reference point, yet no one remembers his name. Grove documented the telemetry and didn't make it into any guide to the Reichstag. The mechanism works. The names do not. Think about what this means in terms of how we write history. We remember the architects, Barry, Vallot, Steindl. We remember the patrons, Nicholas I, Philip II, Francis I. We remember the artists who painted the halls and the sculptors who crafted the facades. But we do not remember those who created the conditions in which all these people could work, convene, heal, and make decisions. The engineers of the air are the support staff of history, invisible, just like their systems. The history of architecture is the history of facades. But the buildings I've mentioned do not exist as facades. They exist in what happens inside, within the walls, beneath the floor, beyond the block, in the basement. And this inside is intentionally omitted from the official description of each of them. If you enter the Winter Palace today, also known as the Hermitage, you will walk over a floor that conceals the brick channels of the 19th century. If you visit the Parliament in Budapest, take a look at the chandeliers. If you ever find yourself in St. George's Hall in Liverpool, know that beneath your feet, several meters down, the brick columns of the thermal labyrinth still stand. They haven't gone anywhere. They've just stopped functioning. The mechanism exists, but it remains unspoken. Maybe this is the answer. Not a conspiracy, not a mystery encoded in stone. Just a consistent architectural principle that has never been explicitly articulated, but has always been implemented. Power should not be visible. Its traces are in the walls, beneath the floor, in the cellar, behind the block. The facade is for the public. The mechanism is for those who govern. But there is still one angle that I cannot overlook. What happened to these systems? Most of them were abandoned in the first half of the 20th century, not because they stopped working. None of these systems were officially deemed obsolete for technical reasons. There is no engineering conclusion stating, Amosov's system is inferior to electric heating in efficiency. They were simply no longer used. Quietly, without explanations. Because electricity came along, and with it, a fundamentally different logic. Not an integrated function, but an added service. The staircase of Chambord is inseparable from the building. It cannot be sold separately. An electric air conditioner can be, and it must be. Every 10 years, a new installation, a new contract, a new bill. The stones of Malbork do not sell a subscription contract to anyone. The ice of the Danube does not require maintenance. The Gloria of Escorial operated on straw, the cheapest agricultural waste. None of these systems created dependency on the supplier. None became obsolete on schedule. Perhaps that's why they were so readily forgotten. They weren't replaced with something better. They were replaced with something more marketable. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's economics. Architecture is not only what is visible, it is also what lies hidden beneath the visible. In the 8 buildings I mentioned, the concealed is far more important than the apparent. Chambord, without its famous spiral staircase, is merely a heap of stones in which one cannot breathe. El Escorial, without the Gloria, would be a monolith that would have obliterated its archives within half a century. The Winter Palace, without the Amos ovens, is a beautiful ash heap that would simply burn down again. Liverpool, without its thermal labyrinth, would be a concert hall shrouded in industrial smog. Budapest, without the frozen Danube, is a building devoid of metabolism. La Lavoisière, without its 15,000 drawings, is just another hospital where lives have slipped away. The Reichstag, without Groman's telemetries, is a beautiful shell without a nervous system. Malbork, without granite boulders in the basement, is a frozen shed that one couldn't endure for an hour. In all 8 cases, a building is not what it is on the outside. A building is what happens inside, within the walls, beneath the floor, behind the block, in the basement. And the last thing that lingered with me. The Reichstag of 1894 had electric telemetry, data on the temperature from every zone of the building in real time at the engineer's central control panel. Now, after 130 years, we call it a smart home and sell it as a revolution. Grove had done this before, quietly, in the walls that no one had seen. All 8 engineers on this list did the same thing. They created systems that outlived their names. Reed died forgotten. Amosov, after 5 years without sleep on the construction of a palace that would have burned down again without his furnaces. Grove didn't make it into any guidebooks for the building to which he gave a nervous system. Morin remained in footnotes, a man whose standard, set 170 years ahead, determined how much air a patient received in a European hospital. Their systems worked for decades after they were gone, sometimes centuries. But the official history of buildings tells of those who stood outside, not of those who managed the air inside. 8 buildings, 4 centuries, 1 style, 1 tradition that no one officially passed down, yet was reproduced time and again, in different countries, in different languages, with different materials and different clients, but with the same principle. The mechanism must be invisible. The facade for everyone. The air for those who know where the control is. And the question I leave you with, if all this was known, who benefited from forgetting it?